The demolition crew arrived at dawn on that crisp October morning in 2025, their heavy machinery casting long shadows across the weathered facade of what had once been the Old Road boarding house. For nearly 4 decades, the building had stood empty, its windows boarded up, its paint peeling like old skin, carrying secrets that seemed determined to follow it to the grave. Marcus Winters, the foreman, had demolished dozens of old buildings throughout Massachusetts, but something about this particular structure made him pause. Perhaps it was the way the morning mist seemed to cling to its walls, or how the locals in Boston spoke of it only in hushed tones when they spoke of it at all. The boarding house had earned its reputation through whispers and half-told stories, becoming the kind of place that parents warned their children to avoid, even though most couldn't quite remember why. As the first swing of the wrecking ball connected with the eastern wall, decades of dust and forgotten memories erupted into the morning air. It was then, as the debris settled and the workers moved in to clear the rubble, that someone noticed a piece of paper fluttering in the breeze like a wounded bird trying to escape its cage. The note was yellowed with age, its edges brittle as autumn leaves. The handwriting was unmistakably feminine, written in the careful script that young women of the 1980s had learned in school. The ink had faded to a pale brown, but the words were still legible, still urgent after all these years. At the top, in letters that seemed to tremble with fear, was written a single name: Edmund Hartwell. Below that name, in smaller text that spoke of desperate haste, were the words that would finally unlock a mystery that had haunted Boston for 39 years. If something happens to me, he was the last person I spoke to. He knows what he did. The basement. I checked the basement. The note was signed with a name that made the construction workers exchange meaningful glances. Vivian Ashworth, the young woman who had vanished without a trace from the Old Road boarding house in the winter of 1986. To understand the weight of that discovery, one must travel back to a different Boston, a different America. The year 1986 was painted in neon lights and synthesized music, a time when personal computers were still curiosities and cell phones existed only in the imaginations of science fiction writers. It was a world where young people could disappear more easily, where communication networks were fragile threads that could be severed with frightening simplicity. The Old Road boarding house stood on Maple Street then, a 3-story Victorian structure that had seen better decades. Built in the early 1900s as a family home for a textile merchant, it had been converted to a boarding house during the Great Depression and had remained so ever since. By 1986, it served as temporary housing for young people starting their lives in Boston, elderly residents on fixed incomes, and the occasional drifter looking for a place to disappear from whatever troubles had followed them there. Vivian Ashworth arrived at the boarding house on a Thursday afternoon in November, carrying 2 suitcases and dreams that seemed too large for her petite frame. At 23, she possessed the kind of quiet beauty that made people look twice. Not because she demanded attention, but because she seemed to glow with an inner light that drew others to her. Her auburn hair caught the light in ways that made photographers at the local newspaper where she worked stop their conversations mid-sentence. She had come to Boston from a small town in Vermont, following a job opportunity at the Boston Herald as a junior reporter. It was the kind of position that barely paid enough to cover rent and groceries, but for Vivian, it represented freedom and possibility. She had grown up in a world where young women were expected to marry young and settle into lives of quiet domesticity. But Vivian harbored ambitions that stretched far beyond the boundaries of conventional expectations. The boarding house suited her needs perfectly. The rent was affordable, the location convenient, and the other residents seemed to represent the diversity of urban life that she found so fascinating. There was Margaret Stanton, an elderly woman who had lived there for 15 years and knew everyone's business before they knew it themselves. There was Thomas Fletcher, a graduate student at Boston University who spent his evenings hunched over thick textbooks and survived primarily on coffee and determination. And there was Edmund Hartwell. Edmund occupied the room directly above Vivian's on the second floor, and from her first day at the boarding house, their interactions had been marked by an uncomfortable intensity that she struggled to define. He was a man in his mid-30s, tall and lean with dark hair that he kept meticulously styled. His clothes were always pressed, his manner always polite, but there was something in his eyes that made Vivian feel as though she were being studied rather than simply seen. He worked, he claimed, in insurance, though the specifics of his employment remained mysteriously vague whenever the topic arose in conversation. He kept irregular hours, sometimes leaving early in the morning and returning late at night, other times remaining in his room for days at a time. The other residents had grown accustomed to his eccentricities, but Vivian found his presence increasingly unsettling. The boarding house itself seemed designed to amplify such discomfort. The hallways were narrow and dimly lit, the wooden floors creaked with every footstep, and the walls were thin enough that conversations carried from room to room like secrets being passed through the darkness. The building's layout was labyrinthine, with additions and modifications made over the decades, creating odd corners and unexpected spaces that seemed to exist outside the normal geometry of the structure. Most mysterious of all was the basement. Mrs. Dorothy Chambers, the elderly landlady who had inherited the building from her deceased husband, had declared it off-limits to all residents shortly before Vivian's arrival. She claimed there had been a small flood that had damaged the foundation, making it unsafe for anyone to venture below the first floor. The basement door, located at the end of the first-floor hallway, was kept locked at all times, and Mrs. Chambers carried the only key on a chain around her neck. For Vivian, those first few weeks at the boarding house passed in a blur of adjustment and discovery. Her work at the newspaper consumed most of her waking hours, and she found genuine satisfaction in the research and writing that her position demanded. She was assigned primarily to human interest stories, the kind of pieces that explored the lives and struggles of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. It was through her work that she began to develop the investigative instincts that would eventually lead her to uncover disturbing truths about her own living situation. She learned to notice details that others overlooked, to ask questions that revealed more than their answers, and to trust her intuition when something felt wrong, even if she couldn't immediately articulate why. Her relationship with Edmund Hartwell began to deteriorate in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. He had a habit of appearing in common areas of the boarding house whenever she was present, always with a plausible reason, but with timing that seemed too coincidental to be accidental. He would linger in the hallway outside her room, supposedly heading to or from his own quarters, but she began to notice that his footsteps would pause outside her door and remain there for long moments before continuing. Most disturbing were the gifts. They began innocently enough, small tokens that could be dismissed as friendly gestures from a fellow resident. A newspaper left outside her door with articles he thought might interest her. A cup of coffee that appeared on the kitchen counter with her name written on a note beside it. Flowers picked from the small garden behind the boarding house, left on the table in the common room with no accompanying explanation. But as the weeks passed, the gifts became more personal and more invasive. He began leaving items that suggested he had been paying close attention to her habits and preferences. A book by an author she had mentioned enjoying, purchased from a store she frequented. A scarf in exactly the shade of blue she had worn to work the previous week. Small things that individually meant nothing, but collectively painted a picture of someone who was watching her far more closely than she was comfortable with. Vivian tried to address the situation diplomatically at first. She mentioned to Mrs. Chambers that she was receiving unwanted attention from another resident, but the elderly landlady seemed either unwilling or unable to intervene in what she characterized as normal social interactions between young people. When Vivian attempted to speak directly to Edmund about maintaining appropriate boundaries, he responded with such apparent confusion and hurt that she began to question whether she was overreacting to innocent kindness. But her journalistic training had taught her to trust her instincts, and every instinct she possessed was telling her that something was deeply wrong with Edmund Hartwell's behavior. She began keeping a record of their interactions, noting dates and times when he appeared unexpectedly, documenting the gifts and their increasing intimacy, recording the conversations that left her feeling unsettled and unsafe. It was during the second week of December that Vivian made a discovery that transformed her vague unease into genuine fear. She had been working late at the newspaper office, pursuing leads for a story about missing persons cases that had gone cold in the Boston area. The research was part of a larger series the paper was planning about the challenges facing law enforcement in tracking people who seemed to simply vanish from their lives. As she reviewed police reports and newspaper archives, a name caught her attention: Edmund Hartwell. According to a brief article from a newspaper in Albany, New York, a man by that name had been questioned in connection with the disappearance of a young woman named Patricia Morris in 1984. The woman had been living in a boarding house where Edmund Hartwell was also a resident. She had vanished without taking her belongings, leaving behind only a note saying she needed to get away for a while. The police investigation had been brief and inconclusive. Edmund Hartwell had been cooperative and had provided what seemed to be a solid alibi for the time period when Patricia Morris was believed to have disappeared. The case had been classified as a voluntary missing person situation, and no charges were ever filed. But for Vivian, reading that article felt like stumbling upon her own future, written in yesterday's headlines. The similarities were too striking to ignore. Another young woman, another boarding house, another unexplained disappearance. And at the center of both situations, the same man with his careful manners and watching eyes. She spent the following days conducting her own investigation, using the resources of the newspaper to dig deeper into Edmund Hartwell's background. What she discovered was a pattern that stretched across multiple states and several years. Always boarding houses or temporary housing, always young women who had lived in the same buildings, and always disappearances that were eventually classified as voluntary, leaving behind no evidence of foul play and no clear trail to follow. The more she learned, the more isolated she felt. The evidence she was gathering would have been compelling to law enforcement if she had been investigating someone else's situation, but as the potential target of whatever Edmund Hartwell was planning, she found herself trapped in a web of circumstantial connections that might not be enough to ensure her safety. She began making preparations that she hoped she would never need to use. She wrote detailed letters to her parents and to her editor at the newspaper, outlining her concerns about Edmund Hartwell and providing copies of all the research she had gathered about his background. She hid copies of these documents in various locations, hoping that if something happened to her, someone would eventually find them and understand what she had discovered. And on a cold evening in mid-December, as snow began to fall outside the windows of the Old Road boarding house, she wrote one final note and hid it in the only place she could think of where it might survive whatever was coming next. The basement had been calling to her for weeks, not with curiosity, but with a dread that seemed to emanate from beneath the floorboards. She had noticed Edmund Hartwell's increasing agitation whenever the topic of the basement arose in conversation with other residents. She had seen him studying the locked door with an intensity that suggested more than casual interest. And she had begun to suspect that Mrs. Chambers' story about flood damage was designed to keep people away from something far more sinister than structural problems. On the night of December 18th, 1986, Vivian Ashworth made a decision that would echo through the decades that followed. She had been offered an opportunity to transfer to the newspaper's office in Philadelphia, a promotion that would have taken her far from Boston and far from Edmund Hartwell. She had accepted the position and planned to leave the following morning. But as she packed her belongings in her room on the second floor of the boarding house, she realized that simply running away would not solve the larger problem. If her suspicions about Edmund Hartwell were correct, her departure would only ensure that some other young woman would eventually find herself in the same dangerous situation. She decided to confront the mystery of the basement once and for all. The old Victorian house settled into its nighttime quiet as residents retreated to their rooms, and the sounds of the city grew distant beyond the windows. Vivian waited until she was certain that everyone else was asleep before making her way down the narrow staircase to the first floor, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet runner that Mrs. Chambers had installed to reduce noise complaints from the tenants below. The basement door stood at the end of the hallway, like a monument to secrets that demanded to be revealed. Vivian had anticipated the challenge of the lock and had come prepared with tools she had borrowed from the newspaper's maintenance department. Her hands trembled as she worked, not from the cold, but from the growing certainty that she was about to discover something that would change everything. When the lock finally yielded and the door swung open, the darkness that greeted her seemed to possess weight and substance, as though it had been waiting patiently for someone brave enough or foolish enough to disturb its long vigil. The air that rose from below carried scents of dampness and decay, but underneath those expected odors was something else, something that made her stomach clench with instinctive revulsion. She descended the wooden steps carefully, her flashlight cutting a narrow path through the blackness ahead of her. The basement was larger than she had expected, stretching beneath the entire footprint of the boarding house and extending even further into spaces that must have been excavated specifically for purposes she was only beginning to imagine. And there, in the furthest corner of that underground space, she found the truth that Edmund Hartwell and Mrs. Chambers had been so desperate to conceal. What Vivian discovered in that basement would remain forever locked within the shadows of December 18th, 1986, because she never emerged to tell anyone what she had found. The last confirmed sighting of her came from Thomas Fletcher, the graduate student, who reported seeing her descending the basement stairs sometime after midnight. He had been returning from a late study session at the university library when he glimpsed her silhouette disappearing into the darkness below, her flashlight beam dancing ahead of her like a firefly, leading her into the unknown. By morning, Vivian Ashworth had vanished as completely as if she had never existed at all. Mrs. Chambers discovered the open basement door during her routine morning inspection of the building. The lock had been expertly picked, the door left standing open like an invitation that no one dared to accept. When she called down into the darkness, her voice echoed back empty and hollow, carrying no response except the whisper of air moving through spaces that seemed to hold their breath in anticipation. The police arrived within an hour of Mrs. Chambers' frantic phone call. Detective Ray Morrison, a 20-year veteran of the Boston Police Department, had seen enough missing person cases to know that the first 24 hours were crucial. He was a methodical man with graying temples and eyes that had learned to see truth hidden beneath layers of deception and fear. The basement investigation yielded frustratingly little concrete evidence. The space was exactly as Mrs. Chambers had described it, damaged by water infiltration and structural issues that made it genuinely unsafe for habitation. There were signs that someone had been down there recently, footprints in the dust and areas where the accumulated debris had been disturbed, but nothing that definitively indicated what had happened to Vivian Ashworth. Her room told a different story, one of careful preparation and growing fear. Detective Morrison found the letters she had written to her parents and her editor, documents that painted a chilling picture of a young woman who had suspected she was in danger, but had chosen to confront that danger rather than flee from it. The research she had compiled about Edmund Hartwell's background was thorough and compelling, revealing a pattern of behavior that stretched across multiple states and several years. But when detectives went to question Edmund Hartwell, they discovered that he had checked out of the boarding house on the evening of December 17th, paying his bill in full and leaving no forwarding address. Mrs. Chambers reported that he had seemed unusually agitated during their final interaction, mentioning something about a family emergency that required his immediate attention. His room had been cleaned out completely, with no personal belongings left behind and no indication of where he might have gone. The investigation that followed consumed months of Detective Morrison's life and the resources of multiple law enforcement agencies. The FBI became involved due to the interstate nature of Edmund Hartwell's apparent activities, and agents traced his movements through boarding houses and temporary residences from Vermont to Georgia. They found corroborating evidence for many of Vivian's discoveries, confirming that Edmund Hartwell had indeed been present in several locations where young women had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. But Edmund Hartwell himself seemed to have vanished as completely as his alleged victims. The name appeared to be an alias, carefully constructed with forged documents and false references that had been sophisticated enough to fool landlords and employers, but dissolved under serious scrutiny. Bank accounts had been closed, credit cards cancelled, and any paper trail that might have led to his real identity had been systematically eliminated. The case generated significant media attention throughout 1987. Vivian's editor at the Boston Herald, James Patterson, published a series of articles about her disappearance that highlighted both her investigative work and the broader pattern of missing women that she had uncovered. The series won several journalism awards and brought national attention to the challenges of tracking predators who moved frequently between jurisdictions and used false identities to avoid detection. But media attention, however intense, could not produce the evidence that law enforcement needed to solve the case. Without a body, without a confirmed identity for Edmund Hartwell, and without witnesses to whatever had occurred in the basement of the Old Road boarding house, the investigation gradually lost momentum and resources were redirected to cases where progress seemed more achievable. Margaret and Robert Ashworth, Vivian's parents, refused to accept the possibility that their daughter's case might remain forever unsolved. They traveled to Boston repeatedly during those first few years, meeting with investigators, distributing flyers, and maintaining a presence that ensured Vivian's disappearance would not be forgotten entirely. Margaret, a retired schoolteacher with steel in her spine and determination in her heart, became a fixture at police department briefings and city council meetings, advocating for continued investigation and better resources for missing person cases. The boarding house itself became a focal point for their efforts and a symbol of the mystery that had consumed their lives. They pressured Mrs. Chambers to maintain Vivian's room exactly as it had been left, paying the monthly rent themselves to preserve what they hoped might eventually yield additional clues. The elderly landlady agreed, perhaps motivated by guilt over her failure to protect her young tenant, and Vivian's room became a shrine to possibilities that grew more remote with each passing month. Thomas Fletcher, the graduate student who had been the last person to see Vivian alive, carried the weight of that final sighting through the completion of his doctorate and into a career as a professor of psychology at a small college in Maine. He never stopped wondering whether he should have followed her down those basement stairs, whether his intervention might have changed the outcome of that December night. He maintained correspondence with Detective Morrison for years, checking periodically to see if any new leads had developed and offering to assist with the investigation in whatever ways might prove helpful. Detective Morrison himself became personally invested in the case in ways that went beyond professional obligation. He had a daughter approximately Vivian's age, and the parallels between his own child's aspirations and the dreams that had brought Vivian Ashworth to Boston created a connection that made her disappearance feel personal rather than simply professional. He continued working the case even after it was officially classified as cold, following up on tips and leads during his own time and maintaining files that grew thick with possibilities that never quite developed into solutions. The 1990s brought changes that transformed both the investigation techniques available to law enforcement and the broader social context surrounding missing person cases. DNA analysis became a standard tool for forensic investigation, offering the possibility of identifying victims and perpetrators from evidence that had previously been useless. Computer databases allowed for better tracking of patterns across jurisdictions, making it more difficult for predators like Edmund Hartwell to operate undetected. But these advances came too late to help with the physical evidence from Vivian's case. The basement of the boarding house had been thoroughly searched and documented, but the techniques available in 1986 had been limited compared to what became possible just a few years later. Detective Morrison, now approaching retirement, authorized a second examination of the basement in 1993, hoping that new methods might reveal clues that had been missed during the original investigation. The second search confirmed what the first had suggested. Whatever had happened to Vivian Ashworth in that basement had been carefully planned and expertly concealed. The water damage that had provided Mrs. Chambers with her excuse for keeping the area off limits had also served to eliminate much of the evidence that might have otherwise been preserved. Concrete had been poured in several areas, ostensibly to address structural issues, but also creating barriers that would have made comprehensive investigation extremely difficult without demolishing the entire building. Margaret Ashworth passed away in 1998, 12 years after her daughter's disappearance, having never received the answer she had fought so desperately to find. Robert continued her advocacy work for several more years, but his health began to decline, and his efforts became less frequent and less public. The case that had once generated headlines and television coverage gradually faded from public consciousness, joining the thousands of other unsolved disappearances that haunted law enforcement files across the country. The boarding house itself began to deteriorate as Mrs. Chambers aged and her ability to maintain the property declined. Tenants became harder to find as the neighborhood changed and newer housing options became available. By the early 2000s, the building was largely empty except for a few long-term residents who had nowhere else to go and no resources to relocate. Mrs. Chambers died in 2004, taking with her whatever additional knowledge she might have possessed about the events of December 18, 1986. Her estate put the boarding house up for sale, but potential buyers were discouraged by the building's reputation and the extensive renovations that would be required to make it suitable for modern use. The property sat empty for years, its windows boarded up and its yard gradually reclaimed by weeds and neglect. Detective Morrison retired in 2006, 20 years after beginning his investigation into Vivian Ashworth's disappearance. On his final day with the Boston Police Department, he transferred all of his files on the case to Detective Sarah Chen, a younger investigator who had expressed interest in cold cases and had the technological resources that had not been available to the original investigation. Morrison spent his retirement years in New Hampshire, but he never stopped thinking about the young reporter who had vanished into that basement and the man who had apparently engineered her disappearance. The case experienced a brief resurgence in 2010, when advances in facial recognition software allowed law enforcement to create better composite images of what Edmund Hartwell might look like after decades of aging. The images were distributed nationally and generated several promising leads, but none ultimately led to identification or arrest. DNA evidence from the boarding house basement was re-examined using more sophisticated techniques, but the results remained inconclusive. Thomas Fletcher, now a tenured professor, wrote extensively about the psychological impact of unsolved crimes on families and communities. His research was partly inspired by his own experience as a peripheral witness to Vivian's disappearance and his observations of how the case had affected everyone who had been touched by it. He maintained contact with Robert Ashworth until the older man's death in 2014, and he continued to check periodically with law enforcement to see if any new developments had emerged. The neighborhood around the Old Road boarding house changed dramatically during the 2000s and 2010s. Young professionals moved into renovated apartments and condominiums. Trendy restaurants opened where aging diners had once served simple meals to working-class customers, and property values rose to levels that would have seemed impossible during the 1980s. But the boarding house itself remained untouched, a deteriorating reminder of mysteries that refused to be resolved. Detective Chen brought new energy and modern investigative techniques to the cold case, but she faced the same fundamental challenges that had frustrated her predecessors. Without additional physical evidence or new witnesses, the case seemed destined to remain forever unsolved. She interviewed the few surviving residents from the boarding house era, re-examined all of the physical evidence using contemporary forensic methods, and coordinated with federal databases to search for any matches to the Edmund Hartwell profile. In 2018, Chen received what initially appeared to be a breakthrough when a man named Edgar Hartwell was arrested in Florida for identity theft and fraud. The name's similarity generated considerable excitement, and investigators rushed to determine whether this might be the same person who had disappeared from Boston 32 years earlier. DNA analysis ultimately ruled out the connection, but the incident demonstrated that law enforcement had not forgotten about the case and remained prepared to pursue any promising leads. The boarding house had been scheduled for demolition several times over the years, but various bureaucratic delays and legal complications had prevented the destruction from moving forward. Environmental assessments revealed concerns about asbestos and lead paint that complicated the demolition process. Historical preservation groups argued that the building represented an important example of Victorian architecture that should be restored rather than destroyed. Legal disputes over property ownership and development rights created additional delays. By 2020, the building had become something of a local landmark, not because of its architectural significance, but because of the mystery that surrounded it. Urban explorers occasionally broke in despite security measures, hoping to discover clues that had been missed by professional investigators. Local historians included it on unofficial tours of Boston's unsolved crimes. The property developed a reputation that made it impossible to sell and difficult to develop, trapped in a state of limbo that seemed to mirror the unresolved nature of the case itself. Detective Chen retired in 2022, passing the case files to a new generation of investigators who brought fresh perspectives and even more advanced technological capabilities. DNA phenotyping allowed for more detailed predictions about suspects' physical characteristics. Advanced database searching made it possible to identify connections that might have been missed using older systems. Social media and internet searches opened new avenues for tracking individuals across time and geography. But the fundamental challenges remained unchanged. Edmund Hartwell, whoever he really was, had covered his tracks too well for traditional investigative methods to uncover his true identity or current whereabouts. The physical evidence from the boarding house basement had been compromised by time, water damage, and the limitations of 1980s forensic science. The witnesses from that era were aging or had died, taking their memories and potential insights with them. The demolition that finally began in October 2025 represented both an ending and a beginning. The neighborhood had changed beyond recognition, and the old boarding house no longer fit the character or needs of the surrounding community. But the discovery of Vivian's note behind that loose board in the basement wall suddenly transformed a cold case into an active investigation, bringing new hope to a mystery that had haunted Boston for nearly 4 decades. The note itself was more than just evidence. It was a voice from the past, a final communication from a young woman who had faced her fears with courage and determination. The handwriting analysis confirmed what investigators had already suspected, and the content provided the kind of direct accusation that had been missing from the original case files. Within hours of the note's discovery, a new task force was assembled to pursue leads that had seemed exhausted years earlier. The name Edmund Hartwell was run through databases that had not existed in 1986, and advances in record-keeping and information sharing made it possible to track patterns of behavior across multiple jurisdictions in ways that had been impossible during the original investigation. And for the first time in 39 years, investigators felt genuine optimism that they might finally be able to provide answers to the questions that had tormented so many people for so long. The note's discovery created ripples that extended far beyond the construction site where it had been found. Within 24 hours, the handwriting analysis had been completed, confirming what investigators already suspected. The faded ink and careful script belonged to Vivian Ashworth, and her words carried the weight of prophecy fulfilled decades too late. Detective Sarah Chen, who had inherited the case from Detective Morrison years earlier, found herself leading an investigation that suddenly had more momentum than it had possessed in nearly 4 decades. The task force assembled that week included federal agents, forensic specialists, and investigators from 3 different states where Edmund Hartwell had allegedly operated under various identities. The breakthrough came not from advanced technology or sophisticated forensic analysis, but from the kind of patient detective work that had always been the foundation of successful investigations. Agent Maria Santos, a specialist in cold cases involving serial predators, began systematically reviewing every piece of evidence that had been collected about Edmund Hartwell over the years, looking for patterns that might have been missed or connections that had seemed insignificant at the time. It was Santos who noticed that several of the addresses associated with Edmund Hartwell's various identities were located near institutions for elderly care. The pattern suggested someone who understood how to exploit systems designed to help vulnerable populations, someone who possessed knowledge of administrative procedures and documentation requirements that would allow him to create false identities with minimal risk of detection. This observation led investigators to examine records from nursing homes, assisted living facilities, and social service agencies in areas where Edmund Hartwell had been known to operate. The search revealed a disturbing pattern of employment records for a man named Edward Hartley, whose work history and personal details closely matched what they knew about their suspect. Edward Hartley had worked as an administrator and bookkeeper for various elderly care facilities throughout New England during the 1970s and 80s. His employment records showed him to be competent and reliable, though several former supervisors remembered him as somewhat solitary and overly interested in the personal details of residents and their families. He had left each position voluntarily, always providing appropriate notice and maintaining professional references. Most importantly, the employment records provided investigators with social security numbers, tax records, and other documentation that created a paper trail extending far beyond what had been available during the original investigation. The man they had known as Edmund Hartwell was actually Edward James Hartley, born in Maine in 1951, to parents who had died in a car accident when he was 16 years old. The trail led investigators to a small coastal town in New Hampshire, where Edward Hartley had been living under his real name for the past 15 years. He owned a modest house near the harbour, worked part-time as a bookkeeper for several local businesses, and had established himself as a quiet but respected member of the community. Neighbours described him as helpful and considerate, someone who kept to himself but could be counted on in times of need. The arrest took place on a grey morning in November, almost exactly 39 years after Vivian Ashworth had descended those basement stairs for the final time. Edward Hartley, now 74 years old with silver hair and the careful movements of advancing age, offered no resistance when federal agents knocked on his door. He had been watering plants in his small greenhouse when they arrived, and he set down the watering can with the same methodical precision that had characterized his entire life. His confession came 3 days later, after hours of careful questioning by investigators who understood that they were likely to have only one opportunity to learn the complete truth. Hartley spoke in the same measured tones that witnesses remembered from his days at the boarding house, describing events from decades past with a clarity that was both remarkable and deeply unsettling. He confirmed what Vivian had discovered during her investigation, acknowledging that he had indeed been responsible for the disappearances of several young women across multiple states during the 1970s and 80s. Each case had followed a similar pattern. He would establish himself in temporary housing situations where he could observe potential victims, identify those who seemed most isolated or vulnerable, and then create opportunities to approach them without attracting attention. Vivian Ashworth had presented a different kind of challenge because of her investigative skills and growing suspicions about his background. He had realized that she was researching his past activities and had decided that she posed too great a risk to his continued freedom. The confrontation in the basement had occurred when she had discovered evidence that he had been using the space to store personal belongings of previous victims, items that he had been unable to dispose of but had been unwilling to abandon completely. The basement itself had been his chosen location because of its isolation from the rest of the boarding house, and because Mrs. Chambers had been complicit in maintaining his access to the space. The elderly landlady had been aware of some of his activities, but had been too frightened to report them to authorities, choosing instead to help him maintain the fiction that the basement was unsafe and off-limits to other residents. For investigators and family members who had spent decades searching for answers, Hartley's confession provided the closure that had seemed impossible to achieve. But it also raised difficult questions about how many other victims there might have been, and whether all of their stories would ever be fully known. Thomas Fletcher, now approaching retirement from his position as a psychology professor, traveled to Boston when news of the arrest became public. He met with Detective Chen at the site where the boarding house had once stood, looking at the empty lot where construction of new apartments was already beginning. The conversation they shared was quiet and reflective, marked by the strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness that comes when long-sought answers finally arrive. "I think about that night constantly," Fletcher told Chen as they stood where Vivian's room had once been located on the second floor. "I've wondered for almost 40 years whether I should have followed her down those stairs, whether I could have changed what happened." Chen, who had spent her own career investigating cases where timing and circumstances created permanent regrets, understood the weight that Fletcher had been carrying. "She made a choice to investigate rather than to run away," the detective replied. "That choice was brave, even though it had terrible consequences. Your presence wouldn't have changed who Edmund Hartley was or what he was capable of doing." The trial that followed generated national attention, not only because of the decades that had passed since the crimes were committed, but because of the systematic way that Hartley had exploited vulnerabilities in housing and identification systems to avoid detection. Legal experts debated questions about statute of limitations, the admissibility of evidence that had been collected using techniques that were not available during the original time period, and the challenges of prosecuting crimes where physical evidence had been compromised by time and environmental factors. Hartley's defense attorney argued that his client's age and failing health made imprisonment inappropriate, and that his confession demonstrated genuine remorse for actions that had taken place during a different era of his life. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Walsh, countered that the systematic nature of the crimes and the decades of concealment demonstrated a level of premeditation and callousness that warranted the maximum penalty available under law. The families of victims found themselves grappling with complex emotions as the legal process unfolded. Margaret and Robert Ashworth had both died without knowing what had happened to their daughter, but Vivian's cousin Sarah represented the family during the proceedings. For her, the trial provided answers that brought both relief and renewed grief, confirming the worst fears while simultaneously offering the possibility of justice. "I wish my aunt and uncle could have been here to see this day," Sarah told reporters outside the courthouse after Hartley's conviction on multiple counts of murder. "They never stopped believing that someday the truth would come out. Vivian would be proud to know that her investigation, even though it cost her life, eventually led to justice for all of his victims." The sentence of life imprisonment without possibility of parole satisfied legal requirements for justice, but it could not restore the lives that had been lost or repair the damage that had been inflicted on families and communities. Hartley would spend his remaining years in a medical facility within the prison system, his advanced age and deteriorating health making traditional incarceration impractical. Detective Chen retired shortly after the trial concluded, feeling that her career had reached a natural conclusion with the resolution of the case that had defined her final years in law enforcement. She established a foundation dedicated to improving investigation techniques for cold cases involving missing persons, using Vivian's story as an example of how persistence and advancing technology could eventually overcome even the most carefully concealed crimes. The site where the old road boarding house had once stood became a small memorial park, funded by donations from community members who had followed the case through its various phases over the decades. A bronze plaque near the entrance honored Vivian Ashworth and the other victims, describing them not as casualties of a predator's actions, but as individuals who had possessed dreams and aspirations that deserved to be remembered. Thomas Fletcher attended the park's dedication ceremony, bringing with him photographs and newspaper clippings that he had saved from the boarding house era. He had become an unofficial historian of the case, preserving memories and documents that helped ensure the complete story would not be forgotten, as the people who had lived through it gradually passed away. Vivian was 23 years old when she died, Fletcher said during his remarks at the dedication ceremony. She had been in Boston for less than 2 months, but she had already begun to make a difference through her work at the newspaper. She chose to investigate rather than to ignore what her instincts were telling her about Edmund Hartley. That choice was dangerous, but it was also brave, and it eventually led to justice for her and for all of his other victims. The investigation's resolution also brought attention to systemic issues that had allowed Hartley to operate undetected for so many years. Congressional hearings examined gaps in background check procedures, coordination between law enforcement agencies in different states, and resources available for investigating missing person cases. Vivian's Law, passed 2 years after the trial concluded, established federal standards for tracking individuals across state lines and improved funding for cold case investigations. Dr. Fletcher published a book about the psychological impact of unsolved crimes on communities, using the boarding house case as a central example of how uncertainty and fear could persist across generations. The book became required reading in criminal justice programs and helped establish new protocols for supporting families of victims during long-term investigations. The Memorial Park became a place where people came not only to remember Vivian and the other victims, but to reflect on broader questions about safety, community responsibility, and the importance of trusting instincts when something feels wrong. Parents brought their children to read the plaque and to discuss the importance of speaking up when they observed troubling behavior, even if they could not immediately articulate why something seemed problematic. Detective Chen's foundation funded research into predictive technologies that might help identify patterns of behavior before they resulted in violence, working with universities and technology companies to develop tools that could assist law enforcement in preventing crimes rather than simply investigating them after they had occurred. The work represented a shift from reactive to proactive approaches, inspired by the recognition that Vivian had identified the threat that Hartley represented, but had lacked the resources and support systems that might have protected her from his actions. Edward Hartley died in prison 3 years after his conviction, taking with him whatever additional secrets he might have possessed about other victims or other locations where evidence might be found. His death brought a sense of finality to some aspects of the case, but investigators continued working to identify other possible victims and to provide closure for families who suspected their missing loved ones might have encountered him during his decades of criminal activity. The boarding house case became a standard example in law enforcement training programs, illustrating both the challenges and opportunities presented by cold case investigations. The combination of traditional detective work, advancing forensic technology, and community engagement that had led to Hartley's arrest provided a model for approaching other seemingly unsolvable cases. Sarah Ashworth, Vivian's cousin, became an advocate for victims' families, working with legislators and law enforcement agencies to improve communication and support during missing person investigations. She established an annual scholarship at the Columbia School of Journalism in Vivian's name, supporting young reporters who demonstrated the same kind of investigative instincts and commitment to truth that had characterized her cousin's brief but impactful career. The neighborhood around the Memorial Park continued to evolve, with new residents moving into the apartments and condominiums that had replaced the aging structures from the boarding house era. But the story of what had happened there became part of the community's collective memory, passed down through informal networks and formal educational programs that helped ensure future generations would understand the importance of remaining vigilant against those who would exploit trust and vulnerability. On quiet evenings, when the park was empty except for the occasional dog walker or jogger, visitors sometimes reported a sense of peace that seemed to emanate from the memorial plaque and the small garden that surrounded it. Local residents interpreted this feeling as evidence that Vivian and the other victims had finally found the justice and recognition they deserved, that their stories were being told and their memories preserved in ways that gave meaning to their abbreviated lives. The case's resolution also brought attention to Mrs. Chambers' role in enabling Hartley's activities, raising difficult questions about responsibility and complicity that extended beyond the primary perpetrator. Legal scholars debated whether her fear justified her silence, and whether different social support systems might have empowered her to report her suspicions before additional victims were harmed. Detective Morrison, now in his 80s and living quietly in New Hampshire, followed news of the trial with satisfaction tempered by regret for all the years that had passed without resolution. He had maintained detailed files throughout his retirement, hoping that someday the case would be solved and that his documentation might prove useful to investigators with more advanced tools and techniques. "I always believed that someday we would find the truth," Morrison told a reporter from the Boston Herald, the same newspaper where Vivian had worked during her brief time in the city. "Police work requires patience and persistence, and sometimes the answers come decades after the questions are first asked." The important thing is that we never stopped looking, and that Vivian's courage in investigating this man eventually led to justice for all of his victims. The Memorial Park became a destination for law enforcement officers, journalists, and students of criminal justice who wanted to understand how one young woman's determination to seek truth had eventually resulted in solving a case that had seemed impossible to resolve. The story served as a reminder that individual courage and institutional persistence could overcome even the most carefully planned attempts to conceal criminal activity. As the seasons changed around the Memorial Park, bringing spring flowers and autumn leaves, summer heat and winter snow, the bronze plaque remained constant, its words serving as both remembrance and inspiration. Vivian Ashworth's name was joined by those of the other victims, whose stories had been revealed through the investigation that her courage had initiated, creating a lasting tribute to lives that had been cut short but not forgotten. The case's impact extended far beyond Boston, inspiring improvements in missing person investigation protocols, victim support services, and interagency cooperation that helped prevent other predators from operating with the freedom that Hartley had enjoyed for so many years. Vivian's investigation, begun in the basement of an aging boarding house, had ultimately created changes that would protect future generations from similar crimes. In the end, the demolished boarding house had yielded its most important secret, and that secret had transformed decades of questions into answers, grief into justice, and silence into truth. The young reporter who had vanished into darkness had finally found her voice again, speaking across the years to ensure that her story and the stories of others would be told, remembered, and honored in ways that gave meaning to sacrifice and purpose to the pursuit of justice.